So I will call to order the February meeting of the Scienids Management Board. First of all, we need to take a look at the agenda. Hopefully you've had a chance to review the agenda. Is there any additions? Seeing none, we'll approve the agenda by consent. Secondly, we have two sets of proceedings. We had a webinar on October the 3rd, followed by the annual meeting on October the 24th. Hopefully you've had a chance to read those word for word. And is there any changes to the proceedings? Seeing none, we'll consider those approved by consent. It is now time for public comment on items not included on the agenda. Is there anyone in that beautiful audience back there that wants to comment? Seeing none, we will continue to move forward. And that gets us to Jeff. Jeff is going to update us on the technical committee's reports and actions, and that's as of this past Friday. So let's sit up, pay attention, and listen to Jeff.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just as a refresher, this is the board task up on the screen and some additional guidance sought during the commission's annual meeting back in October of last year. That original task included in the board motion was produce the static spawning potential ratio for a range of slot limits between 14 and 27 inches, associated with bag limits ranging from 0 to 5 fish per person for the southern region and or South Carolina, Georgia, or Florida individually. There was also some additional guidance requested verbally on the northern stock that included interpretation of the yellow traffic light results and to determine if there are methods for providing estimates of bag and slot limit regulation change impacts on the northern stock, despite not having a stock synthesis model to provide projections. So on the TC's first call to address these tasks, the TC determined that the southern stock task could not be addressed in a reasonable time frame without a narrower set of management options to consider. So if you look, think back to that task I just showed, a combination of potential size limit changes across 13 inches of spread between minimum and maximum sizes, and 6 different bag limits resulted in potentially thousands of regulation combinations. And the way the task read is that we would go through and determine what catch reductions each of those combinations would produce. And then we'd have to run those projected catches through the stock assessment model to estimate what those catches resulted in spawning potential ratio. We did talk at the TC about identifying a small set of management options that each state was interested in considering, but the TC indicated that that set of management options could not be brought forth, particularly not knowing how they would impact SPR first. So it was a little bit circular in this discussion. It was also not clear from the motion if the management target identified in the FMP, which is SPR 40%, was the goal, or if alternate SPR levels were acceptable to the board or the target of the board. So in consultation with the TC, the board revised the tasking. This came from the administrative commissioners from the southern stock states via email. And the task was revised to determine stock-wide catch reduction necessary to achieve the management target of SPR 40% and regulation changes that will achieve the necessary catch reduction. So it's sort of the reverse of how the task read initially from the board. Here we're doing projections with the assessment model, determining the catch reductions needed to achieve the target SPR, and then doing the catch reduction analyses with the potential management changes to determine which of those meet that catch reduction needed. So the TC has met several times since the board meeting in October. The TC met on November 7th of last year for their initial meeting to address the board tasks. That is where they developed their request for board guidance on the tasking. And it was also determined that from that point, despite not having guidance from the board at that point, we could start working on catch reduction analyses and how those would be developed in the tools to support those. And so we did form a working group to develop those methods and tools. That working group met twice, shortly after in November of last year, and then again this past January, to flesh out those methods and review the tools that were developed to apply those methods. And then the TC as a whole met again just this past Friday. As part of that call, they reviewed catch reduction methods and tools proposed by the working group. They reviewed southern stock projections and discussed guidance on the northern stock items. So just the details of these catch reduction analyses. The idea here is that the status quo catch that was observed at the end of the assessment time series will be adjusted according to a set of proposed bag, vessel, and/or size limit changes. You'll see that vessel limit is added there, although it was not captured in the original board motion, but in discussions with the technical committee, it became aware that Florida had already implemented vessel limit changes since the assessment, and also some of the other states expressed some interest in considering vessel limits, and so that was added to these analyses as a potential management tool that might be changed. Those catch adjustments that are made to the status quo catch will account for dead discards due to shifting of harvest under a new, for example, a new bag limit to those fish now being released, and then an 8% discard mortality is applied to those new releases, which is consistent with the discard mortality used in the stock assessment. And then at the end of the analysis, the adjusted catch is compared to the status quo catch to determine reduction in dead catch. That's going to be total removals, including harvest and dead discards, that result from the proposed regulations being put forth. The catch reduction analyses will use the MRIP data from 2018 through the 2021 fishing years as the status quo catch. The technical committee decided on this because there was consistent management measures across states during those years, and so there are no impacts on changing regulations to the catch within that those 4 years at the end of the assessment time period. The analyses are set up to account for additional documented mortality, and what I mean by additional documented mortality is both some observed non-compliance, where it appears in the MRIP data that anglers intercepted fish outside of the regulations on the books, but that could also include things like reported dead discards. So when anglers go out, they get interviewed on their catch, and if they threw back a fish that due to regulations and saw that it was dead, they could report that as a dead fish, and that technically gets counted as a harvest in the MRIP data. And so we're using this term additional documented mortality to capture both of those types of situations. The TC reviewed and approved the methods and tools put forth by the working group, and will now apply these to their data under the proposed regulation changes they're interested in considering for their state. One part that came up in these catch reduction analyses that the TC debated for a while was the assumption of constant effort. That's a typical assumption in these catch reduction analyses, but the technical committee was concerned that there's pretty strong information that effort has been changing. And so they did recommend putting forward some sensitivity analyses at the end of this process in the report that the TC puts together. And the intention of those would be to inform the board of risk due to increasing effort. And these three figures here just show the observed directed trips. That's trips that anglers indicated red drum were either the primary or the secondary target of that trip by state. And the sort of open circles projected through that observed time series, and the solid line with circles is just a linear extrapolation of that effort. The table below shows the change in effort projected into the future years relative to the effort observed in the 2018 to 2021 fishing years and the percent increase for each of those states. So this is sort of the idea of the data that we would be using for these sensitivities to give the board some information on how these catch reduction analyses could shake out if in fact effort continues to change. But I think the technical committee also provides the caveat here that although there are some pretty clean relationships looking into the past, effort is notoriously difficult to predict into the future because of various factors that could impact that. So then moving on from the catch reduction analyses to the projections. So we'll use the stock synthesis assessment model that we used in the benchmark stock assessment, and we'll project the stock forward from the terminal year. The stock is projected until equilibrium catches are reached, and I'll show what that looks like on an upcoming slide. And then we would compare the catch at the end of the projection period under the status quo F, or the F at the end of the assessment time series, to the projected catch under an F 40% F level to determine the stock-wide catch reduction needed to achieve that F 40% fishing mortality level. And that F 40% is just the fishing mortality reference point that's associated with the SPR 40%, the management target identified in the FMP. So there's a couple of specifications for these projections needed. The first is recruitment. How are we going to specify recruitment into the future projection years? The way this is done in the model is that you take an average over a specified year range. The technical committee decided to use the full model time series that's used for management advice, which would be 1981 to 2021. The 2022 model estimates, they were made by the model. There was some partial 2022 data, but those 2022 model estimates were not recommended for status estimates. And on the right, you can see the model estimated recruitments across the assessment time series in the open circles. And the dash line, the black dashed line shows the time series average from 1981 to 2021, which ultimately is very similar to the average recruitment from the terminal status years of 2019 through 2021, which is that short red dashed line at the end of the time series. The other specification needed is a fishing mortality level. So there are two projections that are done here to get us the estimated catch reduction needed. The first projection is we're going to project the stock forward under the status quo F levels. Those status quo F levels is the average F estimated at the end of the assessment during the years we use for stock status, which is 2019 through 2021. And is a value of 0.526. And then we do a second projection where we project the stock forward under a F 40% fishing mortality level, so that target fishing mortality level. And that F level is the model estimated F 40% reference point of 0.301. And the first figure at the top on the right shows those F levels that are used in the projection years to project the stock forward. The orange is that status quo F, and then the black is the projection using the F 40% F level. That F is then partitioned amongst fleets in the model. The model includes 3 fleets, one for each of the 3 southern stock states. The F is partitioned amongst those fleets according to the relative F amongst those fleets in the terminal years of the assessment from 2019 to 2021. That's what's shown in the lower right figure, with the dashed line at the end of the time series for each state showing that relative F level that's used to project the Fs forward. Of note here, there were Florida regulation changes that occurred in September of 2022. These are not accounted for in the time series used for stock status determination. They kicked in immediately after the assessment time series used for management advice, which ends in August of 2021. I'm sorry, August of 2022. And the idea here is that Florida would get credit for those regulation changes that occurred after the assessment model time series by applying these catch reduction analyses to show what catch reduction they've already put in place with their regulation changes that occurred after the assessment. So the stock here, these figures, this next slide shows some of the projected quantities. This is a 15-year projection, and up on the top right is the projected total removals from the stock across all three fleets. Again, this uses a constant F level in all of these years and projects the stock forward under the two different fishing mortality levels. And you can see that there's an initial bump due to a large recruitment estimated in the model at the very end of the time series. As soon as that large year class works its way through the vulnerable part of the population, that you can see that catch starting to settle in on an equilibrium. And so ultimately what we're using for the estimated catch reduction needed to get the stock back to a F 40% target fishing mortality level are the two data points at the end of the time series. We're just comparing that higher catch under the status quo F to the lower F, to the catch produced under the lower F, according to the F 40% reference point. And that's what gives us our catch reduction percentage down in that last bullet of 28.7%. That's the reduction you see from those 2 points to get from the status quo F to the F 40% level. And below the catch plot is the full time series of spawning stock biomass estimates relative to the spawning stock biomass at 40%. So the dashed line would show anytime that spawning stock biomass is at its target level. And you can see the response in the different projection scenarios, with the black being that lower reduced F 40% target level where the spawning stock biomass begins to increase into the projection period. Whereas under the status quo F, that F continues to decline. So those are the projections and then the catch reduction analyses that we've put together so far. For next steps here, the Southern Stock Technical Committee members will use the catch reduction analyses to determine proposed regulations that meet that specified percent reduction. The TC will meet again to review those proposed regulations from the Southern Stock TC members and to finalize guidance on those Northern Stock items being sought from the board. And then a final report will be provided in meeting materials for the May board meeting coming up in May. So maybe for discussion purposes here today, as we've been working, as the technical committee has been working through this, there have been a couple of points that have come up and have been debated a bit at the technical committee. So the first, and this would be helpful to have guidance on these items so that the technical committee can complete their analyses and know what to package together into a final report for you all to see in May. The TC does recommend that additional documented mortality be accounted for in the catch reduction analysis. So again, this is going to be truly non-compliant fish that have been observed, and then also could potentially be observed dead discards that come through in the MRIP data. And so we're just curious if the board does agree with that, or if they feel that this additional documented mortality should not be included in these catch reduction analyses, and we should do them as though compliance will be perfect into the future. The TC recommends sensitivity analysis on changing effort on catch reductions, going back to the slide I showed earlier, just to give the board some information on risk in how these catch reduction analyses could shake out if effort does in fact increase, whereas for these sort of baseline catch reduction analyses, the underlying assumption is that effort is constant. And so we are, the technical committee is curious if this is something the board would like to see in that final report. And then sort of how to break up the percent reductions needed for the Southern stock states. The TC would like to know if if all states should aim for even catch reductions equal to that stock-wide reduction estimated, or if they should collaborate to reach a stock-wide that stock-wide reduction. So more of a collaborative process amongst the 3 states where that percentage could vary across the 3 states, but ultimately at the end of the day, all 3 states comprehensively get to, or collectively get to that reduction needed. And so that's what I have for an update. I can take any questions.
Mr. Pat Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Jeff. A couple questions before the board feedback questions you posted. I listened to the TC meeting for a little bit last week. I had to jump off, but I was wondering for the kind of the size limit change analysis to get reductions. Did the TC talk at all about just the very fast growth rate of red drum at that size, especially the lower end of the slot, where at least in the northern zone they could grow up to an inch a month during times of the year, and how that could offset any expected reductions that would be calculated? And after that, I have an unrelated question. Thanks.
Yeah, so the technical committee did not specifically talk about growth rates. I think the underlying assumption of those size limit change analyses that we put together are that essentially angler behavior doesn't change. So they're going out, they're targeting the same sizes, they are fishing at the same time of year. And so that those growth rates that are being experienced by the population that was caught in the 2018 to 2021 years would be comparable to what they would catch into the future. And so that seasonality type of aspect would be the same or consistent. So those are the assumptions under that size limit change analysis.
Okay, thanks. And in your presentation where you showed the projections for F of 40% and you're recovering the stock, it looked like under the F 40% that the projections kind of just fall short of hitting the target biomass. So is it safe to assume that if the goal of the board was to rebuild the spawning stock, we would need to come up with like an estimate of F rebuild, which would be a lower fishing mortality to meet that spawning stock biomass target, and therefore probably be a higher reduction? Am I understanding that correctly?
So there would be the different level potentially if you wanted to use the same time frame as what we have up here of 15 years, or it could be a longer time frame at this current F level that's shown here, and it would just be a longer period for that SSB to hit that SSB target.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we go back one slide just so I can have a question about? So documented mortality and talking about the non-compliance fish. You mentioned in a previous slide that we were going to kind of look at maybe looking at a different way to phrase that or a different name. And in this request, are we specifically talking about the non-compliance fish, or are we talking about both, the observed and the non-compliance as well?
So we're talking about both here, and it's a little tricky to partition those out. You could dive into the MRIP data further, and basically what they report, MRIP reports, is 2 types of harvest. There's A, which is available for the interviewer to actually see and confirm that it was harvested, and then there's B1s, which are reported by the angler as dead. So that could be anything from filleted at sea to observed dead, thrown back. They know it's dead, so they're not going to say that it was released alive. And so you could partition the data out into what was actually brought back and landed and reported harvested versus those B1s that are just reported dead. But it's kind of hard to further differentiate those because there's not necessarily a disposition reported with those. So it could be all of them were filleted at sea. It could be some of them were, and some of them were reported dead discards, or all were dead discards, and we don't know exactly how that would shake out. And so it's a little tricky to partition all of that out. But what we're talking about here would be inclusive of both those B1 fish that were reported as dead, and then also true non-compliance, where there is information that suggests that maybe a number of fish well below the size limit were landed, and that's like a true non-compliance issue. So it would be inclusive of both of those issues.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And follow up, I mean, not to go down a rabbit hole, I don't know about, I'm not quite clear on Georgia or Florida, but I know in South Carolina, they can't be filleted at sea. So I don't know if that helps or not, or makes things more difficult, but anyway, I appreciate that. That was my secondary question, is how difficult would it be? Understanding it's how they're reported is the issue, but how difficult it'd be to separate those two. So thank you.
I think we have Marina online. Marina, you are unmuted.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to say thank you to Jeff for putting this together. This was great. Thank you so much. I wanted to ask, has non-compliance ever been used for other species when assessing catch reductions?
Yeah, so I can offer one example, and that's striped bass. So for striped bass, going back into time, different analyses, catch reduction analyses applied for striped bass have accounted for this sort of non-compliance issue. There's some nuances for striped bass where they have like bonus programs that some states or areas are allowed to retain fish that are sort of outside of the size limits that are more widely applied to the coast. And so in their non-compliance analyses, it captures that, but also truly non-compliant fish, which there is some indication in other areas where there is true non-compliance. So that is one example where another species accounts for non-compliance on the technical side of thing in these catch reduction analyses that then go to the board.
Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Yeah. So just wanting to make the comment that Florida's concerns with including non-compliance is, we feel we should address non-compliance through enforcement and education, as opposed to potentially penalizing those anglers that do follow the rules. But I appreciate you answering my question. Thank you.
Kip, I also had concerns over the perceived recorded increase in effort. I mean, that 33% increase, and that is the most recent 3 years that you used compared to the long term, right? That was how you achieved the increase?
That was the 2018 through 2021 years that we're using for the catch reduction analyses, the average effort over that period compared to the extrapolated effort following that trend out into future years. So that was compared to what we would get from expanding that relationship out to 2025 through 2028 and taking the average over those years and comparing those.
Yeah, and though I have no doubt that effort is increasing in the state of Georgia, I do know that two of those years were COVID years where effort went through the roof in Georgia because, hey, we stayed open and people were buying boats and going fishing, right? So I'm a little hesitant to use increased effort based on those 3 years because it does look pretty high. Ben.
Sorry, Jeff, I don't know if you're gonna. In that same vein on effort that Doug is mentioning, is there any account for because the time frame for the projections correct was 2018 to 22, is that correct? 21 with the MRIP noting some concerns with the FES projections which started in 2018. If we were to extend that timeline of effort, I don't know if we were to see that increase during that same time frame, and given those concerns, not to say that it's not important to utilize for use if trying to show some concerning trends or being cautious, but just want to throw that out there. I didn't know if that was something that was brought up within the TC in those discussions, and that'd be a point of some concern.
Yeah, so particularly the FES issue with IMRIP was not really brought up amongst the TC and discussed. I think there was some comments from the technical committee that the relationship that we saw going back into earlier years, holding and looking very relatively clean, gave them confidence that those effort data were capturing real changes that were happening. And I would just add that I think the technical committee's perspective here is that they would just put forward the impacts of the catch reduction analyses as sort of a sensitivity and upper bound on what impact that could have to catch reductions, but that the catch reductions under a constant effort assumption would be sort of the baseline that they would recommend. So I just wanted to add that comment.
Thank you very much. That's helpful. Thank you.
Marina, your hand's still up. You have continued input, question?
Nope, sorry, just a lingering hand.
So Kip, just trying to understand the next step, right? So my TC member has already provided me with a use of the tool, right? 28.7% reductions. Here's the possible krill vessel size, right? So are we expecting each of the 3 states TC members, or if what I heard you say, the TC members will provide those reductions, those needs to you, and that'll be a recommendation from the TC?
Yes, so they will report back to the technical committee, and ultimately the technical committee would include in their report a recommendation of, we believe these, sets of management options from this state meet the necessary percent reduction, or they do not, and this is what we think they meet. So I think that would be the product provided from the TC, and we have not talked about specifics of like what number of combinations we would be looking for from each TC member, whether it's 1, a set of 4. We have not gone into those details, but ultimately would be a report back of these are the proposed regulation changes. These are the percent reduction in catch that they would achieve, and this is how it compares to what's needed from the projections.
Yeah, so forgive me for my lack of understanding on it, right? But so if that then comes back as a recommendation from the TC, then I, as the state manager who has that TC representative working for him, has to go back, if I so choose, go back and sort of refute or argue against whatever that recommendation may be, if it's set pure for conservation equivalency purposes, if it refutes in any way the tool that was provided to them. Does that make sense? The TC has developed a tool that our TC member can go back and develop these options. Well, here's the few options that he's got. I, as the manager, may not want to use those. So then I've got to come back at this group with a equivalency request, as opposed to being able to do it on the front end. Am I missing it?
Jeff, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe you can work with your TC member to propose options that Georgia is comfortable with. So the TC member does not have to operate in a vacuum.
Okay. Bud and then Chris.
Thank you, Doug. So if the TC generates the analyses that tell us what state-specific reductions need to be made to reach the target 28%, how would we take those and combine them back together to address this third bullet here if we wanted to collaborate to reach the reduction on a stock right basis? Because they won't be additive. I mean, it's not like, well, if Florida accounted for 50% of the 28%, then that means that South Carolina and Georgia have to come up with the remaining 50% of the 28%. So how would we use those numbers to do what I think we will be doing is that third bullet? I think that's what we'll agree on. So how will the information they provide us allow us to do that?
So I think we could look at magnitudes of these catches and come up with so we could add those together across states and determine if it hits that 28.7%, even though each state might have something that's different than 28.7%. We can take those catches that generated their percentage at their state level and add those catches up on both the status quo level and then on the adjusted level, and calculate a coast-wide reduction percentage to see if it matches that. So for example, you know, if the states got together, the 3 states got together and they were all comfortable with a set of regulations within their own state that achieved different percentages than that 28.7%. But when you add up those catches across states and look at them compared to those status quo catches before those regulation changes, if it hits that 28.7%, that would be on target collectively across the stock.
But continue.
So basically, it's kind of like a weighting process to make sure that they are weighted appropriately, that the reductions are weighted equally to the contributions to the fishing mortality, right? Okay.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, before I was going to provide some board feedback, but Doug, just thinking about the next steps you were discussing. So this is probably to Tracy. I think I know the answer, but when we come back here in May with this information, in order to move forward through the FMP, then the board's going to need to take action to initiate either an addendum or an amendment to actually get this into the plan. Am I correct on that?
I believe so, yes.
Okay, all right, thanks. So definitely more steps along the way. Yeah, so just the kind of, you know, since the board feedback is teed up here, yeah, I think trying to estimate future effort is problematic. I think we, you know, for the TC to assume that effort could increase either through more people fishing or just the existing gear and technology getting even better than it is right now, which is way better than it was 20 years ago, should be probably considered when we ultimately decide what management to make. But you know, trying to have a linear relationship is really hard, especially for a fish like red drum, where effort is driven by availability, and you get these pulses of good year classes coming through, and then everyone's a red drum fisherman, and then you get back to normal or below average year classes, and it's really just the kind of the diehard drum fisherman fishing. To the top bullet regarding documenting undersized, oversized fish and the reductions are accounted for it. Yeah, I fully support that. Jeff, you mentioned that's been done for striped bass. I know it's been done for summer flounder. It's regardless of how much enforcement and our education and outreach you may have, you're always going to have undersized or oversized fish. And some people are nice enough to let the MRIP clerks measure them, and so we can document it. But and we have make a lot of enforcement cases on oversized and undersized and over the bag limit fish. I think it's the cleanest way to do this and make sure we meet the management goals through these reductions is to account for it at this level. Thanks.
Before I do, but I do know that there was concern, at least from my APIS person, right? So that we're measuring fish in fork length, and there may be some estimation errors or some calculation errors there, as well as, you know, some of the, and they're also measuring in millimeters. So when we get to the upper end, you may, in other words, when I look at 13-inch fish in Georgia, right, I'm like 7% of our harvest was from illegal fish in the 13-inch bin. But there's concern from my APIS member that that may not be necessarily the case. It may be that rounding error. So I'm a little cautious to necessarily use all of those. To that point, Chris?
Yeah, to that point, that's a good point, Doug. I would listen to that part. But thinking about it, since there's a slot, we have a lot of fish that are measured in fork length through our APIS sampling right at 27 inches, which total length is going to put it at 28 plus, which is oversized. So you kind of get that uncertainty with fork length to total length on both ends, which basically shows you are getting fish that are harvested outside of the slot limit.
So,
Yeah, just to follow up on that theme, we've been grappling with this. I mean, we measure in millimeters and manage in inches, you know, and it just creates this ongoing predicament of how to deal with the uncertainty that creates. And then, you know, the thing about this that also troubles me is the self-reported dead discards, you know, and the fact that they're not validated. They are self-reported, and you know, you're counting on a fisherman to give you an accurate determination of the status of that fish when it may went in the water and been temporarily stunned, but it was perfectly fine later on. But you're just kind of categorically counting those as dead fish, and you're also not getting length measurements on them. I mean, you're getting so how do you assign them to a size and age category? It layers another level of uncertainty for a species where we've always struggled with high degree of uncertainty. Unlike striped bass, where at least you're getting some harvest of larger fish, we're cropping these fish off at juvenile ages. So I don't know that I just totally oppose that, but it gives me great concern when you see those estimates generated by a very low number of intercepts. And then, all it takes is the typical thing we see with MRIP with, one intercept, boom, it blows up, and you have a disproportionate impact on mortality.
Thank you. And Marina, I've got you coming up. Just hold one sec. So Kip, looking at reported dead discards versus calculated dead discards versus the mortality rate, right? If you use the mortality rate against everything that was just released, did you look at which was greater?
Well, we don't have like a fraction of those reported discards that die and don't die. So it's either an angler will report and say, I threw a fish back, it was dead, so it should be counted as harvest. Those are those B1s. And then we have those B2s, which we have, the total number that angler said, these were all released alive. And then we use some rate from published literature or other sources to say, we think after this fish swims away from the boat, this number of them are going to die. And so we don't have sort of that comparison to make from those B1 fish. We don't know what the starting number of fish that they would be releasing and then what proportion those would die to compare to that assumed rate.
Yeah, I mean, because to Spud's point, not necessarily knowing whether the fish lived or not, just floated away. It would seem to me that if you applied the 8% accepted mortality rate across the board to releases, you would get a lower total number of dead discards. But backwards way of thinking, maybe.
And I could add to it, there's something that the TC could do. The TC could further dive into these data and determine what proportion of the harvested fish were reported as B1s as opposed to type A fish that were seen at the dock as confirmed harvest. So I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, and that's something that we could dig into just to provide the board more information as to how many of these fish may be accounted for through this B1 sector, this reported dead for some reason. And I heard the comment that you can't fillet them at sea. I don't know the full list of dispositions that might make up, but I don't know if that's the only other disposition. Is if it's a B1 and it's a red drum, does that mean that it was discarded dead, or is there some other reason that accounts for that B1? I'd have to look into those details further, but that is something we can provide, is that how many of those B1 fish are in these data sets to have some better confidence about what of those were reported harvest and what of those were actually seen as harvested fish.
Marina?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I just again wanted to reiterate the concerns with the uncertainty with MREP estimates. And as Jeff mentioned, Florida has recently made management changes to address stock concerns. So we have had the benefit of ground truthing these catch reductions, and the model, as you mentioned, estimates a 16.8% reduction or 14% with non-compliance. And with our regulation changes that went into effect, the data 2 years post regulation changes, Florida has actually realized a 21.6% catch reduction. So this kind of makes it seem like the model is already conservative enough without adding the non-compliance, and we feel that the non-compliance is overly conservative compared to what reality is actually showing and what we've actually seen in our trends.
Yeah, thanks for that. I would just add the comment that, yeah, Florida is in a unique situation as opposed to the other states because they do have these observed catches post-assessment model. There is 2 years of data. I would just note that there are other factors going into those realized catches. There are things like variability and year class strength that are going to lead to different catches, whereas these catch reduction analyses basically are assuming sort of a constant recruitment to generate what those catch reductions would be. So that is one distinction to keep in mind with the sort of realized data and with these catch reduction sort of simulations that are done.
So I know that the 28.7% number caused a lot of consternation in the southeast corner this past Friday through the weekend. And so there had been some discussion about additional requests of the TC. Is anybody interested in discussing that, Marina or Ben? If not, Marina, you have your hand up still?
Yeah, I would like to make a motion if now is the time for that. Again, I want to thank ASMFC staff for putting this together, and Jeff, everything was very well done. Thank you so much. But I would like to make a motion to direct the TC to calculate the catch reduction needed for the southern stock to fish at an F of 30%, 35%, and 40%, just to see what those differences would be, and as well as the projected timeline to reach the threshold and target SPRs associated with each of those F scenarios. And we would also like to not incorporate effort trends or incorporate non-compliance, as I've reiterated a couple times with that as well.
Okay, so I think we captured that, Marina. Do you see it there on your screen? Can you verify that that is what you're asking for?
Yes, I can see it. Yes, that looks good. Thank you.
Before I ask for a second, Kip, you wanted to get some clarification.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify some of the language here. So it reads that we're looking for the timeline to reach the threshold and target SPRs. And I just wanted to clarify that in these projections, when we set a F level and project the stock under a specified F level, we are setting the SPRs. And so when we set that F at that F 40% F level, we are setting the stock to be fished at a level that gives us SPRs of 40%, that target level. I think what the intention here is to identify the timeline to reach the threshold and target SSBs, like what I showed on that slide, that figure a little bit earlier. You see that response when you project the stock forward under a constant F. You see what the response in that SSB is and how it either approaches or moves away from the target SSB level. So I just wanted to clarify and make sure that that was the intent.
Marina?
Yes, that sounds good. You interpreted that correctly.
Okay, we have a motion. Is there a second? Spud? Any additional discussion on the motion? Ben?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually would like to make an amendment to this motion.
Go ahead.
The motion can read as follows for the first sentence. I don't know if I need to read the whole thing again. I think it's keyed up as well. Okay. So I'll read it. Direct the TC to calculate the catch reduction needed for the southern stock to fish at F30%, F35%, and 40%, as well as the projected timeline to reach the threshold and target SPRs under each F scenario, or sorry, the target SSB under each F scenario. These analyses should not incorporate effort trends and should include the F calculations of non-compliance fish, as well as calculations excluding non-compliance fish.
So you basically, we're going to not include effort, but do look at it both with non-compliance and compliant.
That is correct.
We'll look at Kip as he's reading it to see if it makes sense to you.
Yeah, the only thing I'd look for clarification on here is where it says should include in the F calculations, and I think that is intended to read something like should include in, I think you could leave it as just should include in calculations non-compliance fish, because we're calculating catch reductions and not F, so just a
Good with that, Ben? I see a shaking of the head, so remove the F.
Yes, that's fine. I apologize. When I meant,
Where's Pat Keller?
when calculating F30, F35 is what I was trying to say, but yes, thank you. You're correct. I appreciate that.
Okay, does everybody understand the amended? Is there a second? Chris Pat Savage, thank you. Any additional discussion on the amended motion, on the amendment? Marina, does that cause you any concern as the maker of the main motion before I ask for a vote on the amended?
Nope, we're good with that amendment. That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, Ben, go ahead.
I did have a question, and Jeff, you brought it up about potentially diving into looking at the differences between A and B1s. Would that need to be included in some way, or can that kind of just verbally, or if that's, again, I don't know what that amounts to, or the task there.
Yeah, I think verbally, since it's on the record, we can take that back to the TC and that would be enough.
Okay, thank you.
All right, any other discussion on the amendment to the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, is there any opposition? Seeing none, we will consider the amended motion, the main motion, and I'm gonna piece it together now. So it should read, direct the TC to calculate the catch reduction needed for the southern stock deficient F30, F35, and F40, as well as the projected timeline to reach the threshold and target SSBs under each F scenario. These analyses should include in calculations non-compliance fish, as well as calculations excluding non-compliance fish. Is there any additional discussion? Is there any opposition? Seeing none, the motion carries. Kip, is there anything else that we should expect or will we hear from the TC before we get to May?
Nothing else from the TC to the board. I don't think at this point, I think we're good on guidance. I think there will probably be at least 2 full technical committee calls between now and May. So just an FYI on that, but I think we're good right now.
So I'll ask a sort of a procedural question. That back corner, we pretty much chat on a regular basis, right? We talk between the states a good bit. I assume that there's not a formal commission process that we need to go through in order for us to talk about the one of those options where we're going to do this, not do it ourselves, as work amongst ourselves to come up with a solution. There's not a formal process for that, right? Bob's shaking his head no, so I take that as good. All right, anything else on the TC report? Kip, I can't appreciate enough what y'all done to this point. I was hoping we'd have the full by February, then we've heard May, but now you've come back with an awful lot by February, so I appreciate that very much. Thank you. All right, item number 5, we need a vice chair. Do I see a motion from Mr. Woodward?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman, and it's my honor to nominate Ben Dyer from the Palmetto State as vice chair.
Excellent. Is there a second? Oh, Mr. Semino, thank you very much, sir. Appreciate that. Is there any opposition? Is there any discussion about this? Is there any opposition? Seeing none, congratulations, Mr. Dyer. Mr. Executive Director, thank you very much for getting us moved up. I think we used the hour and giving back 15 minutes extra, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
We are, is there any other business before None? We're adjourned. Thank you.